Welcome to Critical Perspectives on the Food Climate Migration Nexus. My name is Megan Carney, and I am Associate Professor of Anthropology and Director for the Center for Regional Food Studies at the University of Arizona. I'm also a visiting fellow with the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute. So thank you all for being here today. We have an exciting program ahead. I first want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, the University of Arizona's Center for Regional Food Studies, as well as the Migration Policy Center. Our agenda for today, we have about an hour and 15 minutes and a lot to cover in that time. So we have 4 panelists who will be presenting on their work and sharing some of their perspectives on the food climate migration nexus. Michelle Pembert, Annie Shattuck, Lisa Kelly, and Esteli Jimenez Soto. So we will proceed in that order. Following their presentations, there will be a discussion among the panelists, and I will be leading that discussion. And then we will have ample time for Q&A with the audience, and we will close. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, distinguished speaker. So Dr. Michelle Pembert is Professor of Agroecology and Food Politics at Coventry University and the Director of the Center for Agroecology, Water and Resilience in the UK. An agricultural ecologist by training, he previously worked at the UK-based International Institute for Environment and Development, the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics in India, and the University François Rabelais du Tour in France, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature in Switzerland. He has been a board member of several international organizations working on food sovereignty, sustainable agriculture, environmental conservation, and human rights. From 2013 to 2017, he was a member of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the Committee on World Food Security at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. His research interests include agroecology and food sovereignty, the political ecology of biodiversity and natural resource management, participatory action research methodologies, and deliberative democratic processes. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Is it okay if I start, Megan? Yep. So I'd like to offer a few opening remarks just to set the scene in very broad terms, and then we can narrow down during the conversation and the Q&A sessions. But first, just state that it's now recognized that food and agricultural systems are responsible for at least 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And industrial agri-food systems in particular contribute the largest share of climate warming greenhouse gases because they're so intensive in the use of fossil fuels. Now, interestingly, in response to the threats of global warming, 2 contrasting models of development seek to radically transform food and farming today. And the first focuses on modernizing and sustaining capitalism through the promotion of the 4th industrial revolution in food and agriculture. And the second pathway to transformation emphasizes food sovereignty and agroecology to cool the planet and feed everyone. So I'd just like to look at both scenarios for transformation in turn, and make the claim that the 4th industrial revolution is really a driver of climate change and migration. Historically, labor-saving agricultural technologies and enclosures of the commons have combined with agriculture and trade policies to exclude people from the land and encourage migrations to cities. But despite the dire human costs of this development model, business as usual continues today. The robots, digital technologies, and synthetic biology of the 4th industrial revolution for food and agriculture are set to replace farmers on a very large scale. President Emmanuel Macron recently announced in his plan, France 2030, that his government will invest 2 billion euros in fourth industrial revolution agriculture. And the French government is really championing a digitally interconnected agriculture with drones, intelligent robots, joysticks, and the use of gene drives in uniform landscapes monitored by 5G technology. And interestingly, the more triumphant proponents of the fourth industrial revolution already anticipate that as few as 170,000 farmers will be able to produce all the food France needs in the next 5 to 8 years. Now that's 60% less farmers than today. Now these radical agri-food system transformations in France prefigure very similar developments in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and Europe. 4IR technologies, industrial revolution technologies, are set to massively replace the living labor of people and nature with the dead labor of machines. And by accelerating the systematic economic genocide of the peasantry and indigenous peoples, this new version of industrial food and farming is actually fueling significant migrations of people off the land throughout the world. And last but not least, the spread of fourth industrial revolution is also aggravating climate change because of the huge energy consumption required to manufacture and run digital technology, robots, and the Internet of Things based on 5G technology. So the climate destabilizing effect of fourth industrial revolution technology is likely to be very severe and will significantly contribute to human displacement and outward migration from areas that are affected by increasingly rising temperatures, droughts, and floods. And now let me turn to another scenario for transformation, which is about food sovereignty and agroecology cooling the planet. And here throughout the world, we're seeing that global peasants and social movements are mobilizing to build, defend, and strengthen food sovereignty and agroecology as the pathway towards a much more just, sustainable, and resilient food and agriculture. And really, at heart, agroecology and food sovereignty strive to reverse the fundamental contradiction between capitalism's drive for a controllable uniformity and nature's thrust for ever more diversity and differentiation. So from an environmental perspective, this essentially means bringing back biodiversity into relocalized agri-food systems and enabling the capture of large amounts of greenhouse gas for storage in the vegetation and soil. Rooted in indigenous knowledge and the science of ecology, food sovereignty-based agroecological practices actually conserve and enhance biodiversity. We're talking here about multi-species polycultures, intercrops, agroforestry systems, genetic mixtures, mixed farming, agro-silvopastoral systems. And all these systems fix and sequester significant amounts of carbon in the vegetation and in the soil. They both help mitigate and adapt to climate change simultaneously. So the shift from industrial uniformity to living diversity is further enabled by a transformation that seeks to re-territorialize food and fiber production, distribution, and consumption. And this particular approach promotes decentralized circular systems that try to mimic natural ecosystems at different scales, from individual farms to entire cities. And circular systems that combine food and energy production with water and waste management not only increase the sustainable use of biodiversity, they can also reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well as ecological and material footprints. And interestingly, they can help maintain a good quality of life through a controlled process of degrowth in consumption and production. So in contrast to the industrial model, agroecology as part of food sovereignty is really based on principles of diversity, autonomy, decentralization, distributed power, dynamic adaptation, as well as democracy. Now, public investments in these areas can create livelihoods and strong local economies that significantly reduce human displacements and outmigration. Regenerating local ecologies and economies in territories may also encourage migration back into rural areas, as well as enable more effective local mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And I'd like to close there for these opening remarks, just set that as a broad stage for discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. Lots to chew on, and we will revisit in the discussion portion. So I will go ahead and introduce our second distinguished speaker. Dr. Annie Shattuck is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and the Sustainable Food Systems Science Initiative at Indiana University. Her research uses political economy and science studies to study agrarian change and rural health in Southeast Asia and the United States. Her recent work looks at the changed global pesticide complex and its effects on bodies, environments, and global production networks, as well as the relationship between ecological change, agrarian livelihoods, and migration. Dr. Shattuck is an co-editor of the Journal of Peasant Studies, and she received her PhD in geography from the University of California, Berkeley. She is also the co-author of many, many articles, but notably also the book, The Politics of Food Sovereignty, Concept, Practice, and Social Movements. Okay, thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Megan. I promised to say something about this moment that we're living in before I start talking, and I think that it is worth saying the obvious here, especially given the deadly heat waves in India and the drought in the Horn of Africa, that anything optimistic in this conversation is somewhat of a moot point if we don't keep fossil fuels in the ground, and there is no way around that. So not to beat a dead horse, but I feel like that needs to be acknowledged every time we have this conversation. And it isn't drought and it is not heat that is causing what the UN warned last month of a hurricane of hunger and a, quote, meltdown in the global food system. These comments came on the heels of a year of COVID disruptions when global hunger had increased already by 74%. Prices right now for basic grains are higher than they were in 2007 and 2008, right at the beginning of the Arab Spring, in which we saw not just enormous political upheaval in Tunisia and Syria, but food rebellions across 46 countries. And the lessons from that moment, unfortunately, seem to have been entirely forgotten, and they are ones that we need to relearn in order to deal with becoming climate chaos as well. So my comments are about how we envision a more resilient global food system, how we envision a just transition in the rural world. And over the last 30 years, instability in the global food system has increased dramatically, right? It is less resilient than it was not so very long ago. In the 1980s, there were only a handful of countries that were really reactive to big swings in the global market. And by 2008, in the last food crisis, so many countries had become dependent on the global market that it was undermining the stability of the entire global food system. So in 2008, as of now, for every 1% increase in global food prices, we get 16 million people who are thrown into hunger. That is a product of history, right? It's a product of the liberalization that has destroyed peasant economies across the global South. And then as now, the majority of those facing hunger are rural people and migrants from rural areas, right? The very people who have been dispossessed and thrown out of work by the way the global food system is structured. So this price spike to me is a wake-up call, right, to learn the lessons from the last global food crisis and to really think about what we might need to radically reorient the global food system to address the root causes of vulnerability from big global trade networks all the way down to the farm scale. So I have a few key takeaways from some things I've been working on and reflections with colleagues that I can offer, and I can't promise they'll be entirely coherent. And the first is that a really transformative climate policy at the Food Climate Migration Network really needs to take a systems approach, and it needs to change who wins and who loses in our current global food regime. So as the IPCC report recently confirmed, and Michelle just discussed, agroecology is a key climate solution, right? It can buffer against extreme weather. It can provide an on-farm safety net. It can store carbon in soils and vegetation. And this really only goes so far. My colleague Eric Holpe-Minnis and I put out a paper recently revisiting the lessons for understanding approaches to climate resilience from Hurricane Mitch, which was the most destructive hurricane ever to hit the region at the time. He did it, and he did a fantastic study 20 years ago looking at pairs of agroecological farms and conventional farms to see how people fared after the disaster. And as Michelle sort of indicated, those that were using these agroecology practices that he listed had less damage, fewer losses, they bounced back faster. But if you farmed on slopes that were too steep because you were poor, if you had really marginal land, agroecology did not save you, and no one else did either. So 20 years on, there's all these sort of resilience projects that are really looking at maybe borrowing some agroecology practices, maybe borrowing a few techniques here and there to try to improve resilience at the farm scale for individual farms. And there's still almost no action on the things that confer broader agrarian resilience, like land reform, access to fair markets and credit, state support for smallholder agriculture, ecological extension, social forms of insurance, and the like. So this lack has been part of a great sort of unraveling of rural life and environments over the last 30 years. And it's also at the root of a lot of what gets labeled climate migration. And Camilla Dewan's work, I think, is actually much better than mine in this. She has just sort of beautiful, beautiful work looking at the way peasant farmers fleeing flooding in Bangladesh, right, which gets labeled climate displacement, sort of par excellence, really are not fleeing from climate impacts. They're fleeing the impacts of agribusiness, of local elite and colonial changes to hydrology, of elite land grabs. And the point there is that calling everything climate migration or displacement hides some of the most important local dynamics, and it makes it impossible to address root causes. So I was lucky enough to be able to do some thinking with Lisa Kelly, who's here, and our colleague Kim Thomas, to compare some notes on what we were seeing in different parts of rural Southeast Asia. And we found very, very similar patterns in really different contexts. When she sort of pointed to what we called cumulative socio-natural displacement, which is a mouthful that hopefully signals how important it is to look at the ways that dispossession and market changes and state policy, but also past ecological transformations, get sedimented onto the landscape and make people more vulnerable to displacement after even small climate shocks. And hopefully Lisa will talk about that with some real research that's really beautiful. My third point is that migration is a fact of life for much of the rural world. It's part of how our food system already works, and that migrants' rights are a crucial part of the just transition. So in my own work in upland Laos, was working in part of the country that had never been a source of migrant workers. And in the last decade, migration has become both an opportunity and an imperative for young people. It's a way of ensuring food security, as access to forests and access to ample land has all but disappeared. And this has become more true across the rural world. So we need to recognize that the conditions under which people leave, labor, send money, and return are crucial to livable rural lives, right? So that migrant labor is both a product of agrarian injustice and can create the conditions for rural resistance in spite of it. So when I say we need to take a systems approach, that means the households, the relationships of care that are stretched across time and space all need to be part of a vision for what the food climate migration nexus looks like. And I have lots more to say, but I will stop there.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. All right, so our first two speakers provided some sort of theoretical frameworks for us to think through these complex problems. And our next two speakers are going to be building on these ideas and concepts, but also integrating some specific case studies. So first, I would like to welcome Dr. Lisa Kelly, who is an assistant professor of geography and environmental sciences at the University of Colorado, Denver. whose work in Hawaii, Indonesia, and Nicaragua integrates critical human geography and geospatial science to understand the interrelations between ongoing agrarian, climate, and mobility transformations. Lisa received a PhD in 2017 from UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science Policy and Management, and holds a BA in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Princeton. She serves as affiliate faculty at the University of Hawaii and is a member of the Pandemic Research for the People's Agroecologies Working Group. Welcome, Lisa. The floor is yours.
Hi, all. Thanks so much, Megan. And I'll dive in and run on the brilliance of what has already been shared. And thanks for the setup to my feminist brilliant colleague, Annie, for letting me sort of latch like a barnacle onto her remarks. But I do want to sort of build on this notion that the dominant accounts of displacement at this nexus of climate, food, migration systems are getting it wrong, and they're missing the relations that matter and obscuring, I think, both the unfamiliar and the familiar dimensions of displacement at present. And I want to talk a little bit about how restoring these accounts through place-based sort of humble applications of both the biophysical sciences and lessons of sort of listening from communities of practice in place can inform a sort of policy and research agenda towards greater justice, and that slows the kind of rural unraveling both Annie and Michelle beautifully spoke about. So I'm going to do an awful thing and share slides. But I'll try not to make it too awful. Some of this is easier to visualize. And I wanted to start with a sensibility. Is this clear for all? Yeah. With two dominant plot lines that are invoked to explain tremendous increases in outmigration from Southeast Sulawesi, the area in Indonesia I've been working for the past 10 years or so. And the first of these is that displacement is a product of sort of neoliberal disasters of development, in this case in the form of land grabbing. A land grabbing that is seen to gobble up people's land, fail to absorb or sufficiently remunerate their labor. And in this way, send people or push people out of rural landscapes. And certainly there is evidence for the scope of these phenomenon, particularly since the financial crisis of 2007-2008 in this region. And let me see, can I change slides? Perfect. The second is that it's a disaster and a displacement of climactic origins. And the models in this case suggest that wet seasons are going to become wetter as we go, and that more anomalous and extreme precipitation events are going to become more probable, manifesting in a decreasing return period of floods. And these are trends for the future sort of predicted to be fully borne out by 2050, but which are already sort of manifest and begetting mass outmigration events, which get called climate displacement. And so these arguments get it partially right. They speak to real trends and important trends, but their partiality obscures, again, these relations that matter, and there's a need to situate them relationally and historically. And so importantly, for instance, one of the things that these dominant scripts or narratives of displacement obscure is that the relations between climate migration and food systems, much as Annie and Michelle have been talking about, have not always pointed in the direction of displacement. And if we think about the sort of indigenous production systems of the Talaki people in this area, they were already managing sort of complex technologies that were diversified, that were mobile and already adaptive in what historically were extensive wetland complexes. Wetland complexes where floods were not destructive, but a source of abundance and a source of regeneration and production power. And so these are the sort of histories of other relations and ones that sustained wetlands that are now seen as sites of resource destruction and outmigration as spaces for seasonal in-migration to cultivate abundance and to cultivate an extensive food pantry that enabled people to subsist during droughts when upland rice production lands became impossible to cultivate, but also as a buffer on these systems interannually. And so my argument here, or sort of my initial point to preface what I want to share on a research and policy agenda, is that understanding the making of contemporary climate food migration relations and the displacement that results also sort of requires understanding how more regenerative solutions have been dismantled and how climate has been separated out from food and migration. And so here, the enclosures of land taking place and new dimensions of these enclosures in the form of land grabs and the ways they're coming together with climate are a really important starting point, given the scale and scope of their impacts and their ability to sort of further this process of dismantling. And if we look at corporate oil palm in the village I've been working at, one of the insights is that it didn't go into unused forests, unused wastelands, primary forests, some of the dominant narratives of what plantations produce, but it went into people's food gardens. And in particular, it went into agroforestry, fallows full of fruit trees, woody tree species that were a buffer during floods previously. And it went into the lowland swamps and sites of tidal vegetable production that had once been so central to food systems in this area. And the land grabs in this case were not just a sort of moment of ecological destruction and a one-off sort of land loss. They live on in various ways in the sort of ways their effects become ecologized as a mechanism of displacement and displacements upon displacement. So in Vesulutu, for instance, oil palm clearances continue to produce siltation events and accelerated surface runoffs that render anomalous rains disastrous. They continue to sort of cultivate the toxicity of floodwaters that pours into people's homes through agrochemical applications. And they have already sort of removed critical flood buffers, but also render floods possible even during non-extreme precipitation years through these massive networks of roads that have been constructed and which beget landslides and block passages of the river. So my second point, I think, here is that there's a need to really attend to the ecology of these displacements, particularly if we sort of situate them as part of longer cumulative socio-natural displacements and see contemporary enclosures as a sort of punctuation mark on long-standing processes. And this is this notion that Annie's drawing out here that that floods are not an entirely new product of the neoliberal or sort of climate moment, and that they're a product of these prior displacements, including ones that have been affected through forced migration and the recruitment of migrant labor. So this historic wetland complex began to be systematically dismantled under Dutch direct colonialism as migrant laborers and forced labor regimes were used to construct roads through them and block the boundaries between river and land. They were also further sort of separated rivers from floodplains and people from floodplain cultures through new irrigation schemes and green revolution technologies promoted during New Order developments and in the name of food security. Developments which basically continued the swamp clearance projects begun by the Dutch and which constructed a number of canals that now pull floodwaters further from the river than they ever would have gone historically. Plans to sustain these at present, but also ones that intersect with industrial concessions going in throughout the entire watershed and which send siltation into rivers and perform many of the sort of same dynamics I've discussed in Vesulutu. And to secure these investments, the rivers are now being even further straightened, their meanders removed. Some 30 kilometers of the river have been removed over just the past 3 decades. And so we should not be surprised when these altered straightened rivers pump floods into the same places each year, and even in non-sort of flood years, right? And these floods, you'll notice, are concentrated. These are just from the past 3 years, and they've been successive over the past 5 years, are concentrated in what were these wetland groves. So just sort of pausing here to sort of draw the bow on this second point here. It's not only that we need to attend to new enclosures and how they double down, but it's also about our need to sort of turn to the biophysical and geospatial sciences as a tool in reconstructing these place-based relations and as a tool for understanding how displacement, initial sort of displacements that set up these relations, live on in altered ecologies and landscapes. So I have one last point. And I'm not sure how long I'm going, hopefully not too long. But my last brief point is that we should not be surprised why migration has become so necessary to agrarian viability and a farming lifestyle, given these changes, but that there's also a need to resist collapsing all migrations into singular accounts of male out migration, never to return. And here we have multiple modalities of migration, multiple modalities of mobility and immobility that take place as floods occur and as they cement and work in and through crises of hunger. So our data on floods in Basiluta, for instance, suggests that migration does not automatically result from floods. In fact, floods beget short-term immobility on unpassable plantation roads. But they engender a triple crisis of production, both as plantations push off flood costs onto workers, and there's a loss of wages as floods sort of enclose and render production unviable on remaining vegetable lands. And given the losses in mobility that delimit access in the immediate circumstances to extra local work. And so one of the most common experiences of floods, one felt ubiquitously throughout villages, whether you live near a river or not, is a scenario of food and water inaccess and a mandate in some cases to take on new debt. And the result are multiple modalities and multiple stretchings of labor in the wake of these crises and as roads become passable again. It's the stretching of women's labor as they cobble together food production for families at home. It's the outmigration of young family members to feed them in distant work sites, often other plantation ecologies. So I will wrap there. My points very broadly are that to get at this familiar politics of displacement, we need to sort of restory by looking to history, by looking to the ecology of these systems, and by looking to the multiplicity of migration that results. And there are thoughts here on a policy agenda, but I'm gonna stop there. I mean, we can pull some of the insights out in our discussion.
Yeah. Hold on to those insights, Lisa, for our group discussion. Very rich presentation. Would love to spend more time delving into your data. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our final, but still another very distinguished speaker. Very excited to have her here with us. Esteli Jimenez Soto is an assistant professor in the Nutrition and Food Studies Department at Syracuse University. She is a former postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Santa Cruz, which is where she also earned her PhD in environmental studies. Her work examines socio-ecological dynamics at the intersection of agriculture, food, and the environment. She is broadly interested in how the industrialization of agriculture and global environmental change impact social and ecological communities in agricultural landscapes. She is trained in agroecology and has done research around species interactions, biological pest control, labor migration, and political ecology in Latin America and the United States, where she has worked in coffee, agroforestry systems, and strawberry fields. She is interested in pushing disciplinary boundaries and building alliances with scholars, farmers, students, and social movements to foster a more sustainable and just food system. Welcome, Dr. Jimenez Soto. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Megan, and everybody for this wonderful panel. I've already learned a ton. So I'm so nervous to be the last one to wrap this up. But hopefully I can provide some insights from my work in coffee agroforestry in Central America. And I wanted to echo three things from Lisa's presentation. First of all, the importance to understand the complexity of migration. That is not just about climate change, but the political ramifications of industrialization and this capitalist model of development that Michelle was talking about. And second, that this climate change also it's interacting with ongoing simplification of agricultural systems as a result of agribusiness in Central America. And a lot of the displacement that we are seeing to this new, what they're calling rural towns in Southern Mexico or ciudades rurales that are receiving migrants from Central America, really fleeing landslides that are the result of the simplification of peasant agricultural systems. So in my intervention, I want to share a couple of questions from this region and from my work in coffee. So the first question is, what do we know about the effects of climate change impacts for Central America and Southern Mexico, which is where I do my work. So Central America and the southernmost state, Chiapas, has been traditionally characterized as a region with significant exposure to geoclimatic hazards. There's no doubt of that. However, over the past 30 years, there has been the steady increase in extreme events, including storms, floods, and droughts, but with a decreasing trend in annual rainfall and increase in temperature extremes. So we're basically seeing overall more frequent and intense weather events, but less annual rainfall and higher temperatures. So for example, for Mexico, only in 2021, 8 systems impacted or territory, 4 of which were major hurricanes, as opposed to the average 4 to 5 systems that usually land every year. The second question is, what does this mean for human migration and how for this particular region, and how can we complexify this, this food climate change migration nexus? So climate change is no doubt one of the factors sparking migration in the region, but the relationship between climate change and migration, it's also complicated in Central America by ongoing displacement from specific types of violence, job losses from the COVID-19 pandemic, the big elephant in the room. And of course, from my work in agricultural systems in coffee, particularly, increasing outbreaks of agricultural pests and diseases and loss of agricultural livelihoods, or leaving farming altogether. So for example, droughts and the flooding following hurricanes Eta and Lora, which hit Central America really hard in 2020, have had a devastating effect on farmers' livelihoods in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, impacting their food security and potentially encouraging migration. But there has also been a significant trend of deforestation and land degradation for this region, mostly associated with the intensification of agricultural systems, which increase the probability of catastrophic landslides, like the few that we experienced in Guatemala just last year. However, and this is to echo much of what this complexity that other speakers have spoken about, is still very difficult to pinpoint the precise role of climate change on migration. And given these other social and environmental factors, and the fact that this region has also a long established migration pattern with North America already. But I think agriculture and biodiversity are critical entry points to examine the climate change migration nexus for this region, because many regional economies and households in southern Mexico and Central America depend on agricultural production, a lot of it actually still diversified agricultural systems, and also these regions coincide with important biodiversity hotspots. So what can we learn from this entry point from agricultural systems and climate change as an entry point to understand this nexus that we're talking about today? So I want to bring up my work with the case of pests and disease outbreaks affecting coffee production, which is one of the most important tropical crops on Earth, and how this tension could illustrate some key aspects in the relationship between food climate change and migration in the region. So more than 5 million people, and here I enter into this more specific case study of the region, coffee agroforestry systems. More than 5 million people in Central America and Southern Mexico depend on the production of coffee, primarily small subsistence farmers with less than 12 hectares that produce coffee under the shade of trees, which is the way that coffee is produced traditionally, under the shade of mature trees, or also called a rustic coffee agroforestry system. But in recent years, coffee farmers have been challenged by low coffee prices and, most importantly, severe outbreaks of the coffee leaf rust, a fungal pathogen, much of it which has been associated with extreme climate variability. And this is threatening the viability of coffee production and the livelihoods of millions of producers and their families. Just a study this year by colleague Celia Harvey in Costa Rica found that farmer households lost in average 71% of their coffee production during the worst outbreaks of coffee leaf rust from 2006 and 2013, as a response. Household migration doubled in communities that both had a history of migration, but most importantly, those households that did not have a history also began a trend of migration to North America. And from my own observations in Chiapas, the southernmost state of Mexico, this has also prompted farmers to switch from Arabica coffee, which is predominantly grown in the highlands under the shade of mature forests, to Robusta varieties, which are known to be more productive under sun conditions in more intensified systems that require, of course, more fossil fuel inputs. And these intensified systems are more vulnerable to drought and extreme temperatures in landslides. Just recently, I was looking at some videos from colleagues doing monitoring of drought in Veracruz, for example, and these Robusta coffee plantations are being devastated by drought. But really, these farmers are having to sort of switch into these more productive systems to sell to the soluble coffee market, which is being pushed by the agribusiness, right? So we're seeing here this complexity that the other speakers were speaking to. So this is in turn driving forced migrations and the ciudades rurales, or rural cities, that I was talking about earlier. My work in coffee plantations has focused a lot on the livelihoods of farm workers that migrate from Guatemala to Mexico seasonally during the harvest season. And I think we rarely talk about farm workers, migrant farm workers, in the case of coffee and coffee studies. But the reality is about 30% of the coffee that is produced in the world comes from these large plantations that employ seasonal labor throughout the year. And so now that my research is kind of moving into this direction to explore this nexus of climate change and migration, I'm very interested to understand how not just farmers are experiencing this outbreaks of pests given the simplification of their systems, but also how is that sort of cascading to the livelihoods of farm workers who also depend on their on the production of coffee for part of the year. So migrant farm workers might also be at a huge disadvantage given that they are already one of the most marginalized peoples in the coffee production chain. But we know very little, right, about the impacts of climate change in land dispossession in origin, in places of origin, on their livelihoods and in their migration destination, but also back at home. So here I wanted to provide some sort of future directions for this research. And it's really just kind of a note to myself because I'm so excited about this topic. And I think it's just so important that we're here talking about this today and kind of building this wonderful network. So how are farmers adapting their agricultural systems in the face of climate change? And what is the role of information access in adaptation? So what type of information for adaptation are farmers accessing and using to adapt their agricultural systems to changing climate? And what information and infrastructure drives these differences in vulnerability? Another question is, how are migrant farm workers who depend on coffee during the harvest season affected by climate-driven pests and disease outbreaks? And also thinking beyond the effects on sending land systems, right? So not just looking at the effects of climate change and land dispossession on areas, sources of migration, but also in the destination, so the receiving land systems, and how are migrant farmers adapting their food systems in new climatic regions where they are now migrating? How is this impacting farm workers and migrants' nutrition and food security? Is climate change influencing conflict and specific types of violence in sending and receiving lands? And I have also been very interested in the agrarian questions. So how migrants are using these more perhaps intensified plantation systems to subsidize, finance their peasant livelihoods back at home, right? So this kind of more interactive and dynamic interactions between sending and receiving land systems. But I think we are up against a lot of challenges in terms of policy and politics in Latin America in relation to this tension here. I think, first of all, there's very little transparency with reporting in our healthcare systems in Latin America, for example. So it's really difficult to pinpoint what are sort of the struggles of migrants in relation to land dispossession from climate change and more specific violences. But also on the policy and politics side of it, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who is the president now, really has had double standards with migrant communities in the southern border, and really politics that are not welcoming to migrants. And so how does that play into this complex dynamic between climate change and migration? I think it's important to consider. And finally, that there are really no financial incentives to conserve biodiversity in coffee farms. And it's really quite, in fact, on the contrary, incentives to intensify coffee for the soluble market, Nestlé and all of that. Roughly about 1,600 hectares in Chiapas and 2,000 hectares in Veracruz have been converted from Arabica coffee to Robusta for the production of soluble coffee just in the last few years. So I think that that really complexifies these interactions, and I think it's a good entry point to think about agriculture for this nexus. Thank you very much.
Esteli, thank you. That's a wonderful segue. So we're going to go ahead and move into the Q&A portion of our roundtable. So we encourage, we welcome questions from the audience. Please go ahead and insert those in the chat, and we will do our best to address them in the limited time that we have. I actually wanted to pick up on a thread that really came up in everyone's comments. In Michelle's talking about the fourth industrial revolution, Annie alluding to these deeper histories and structural inequalities, and then really with both of the case studies, histories of colonialism and extraction. So as we think about critically the food climate migration nexus, I'm wondering, I'd love to hear from you all, but actually I was thinking maybe we could start with Annie on this question. How can we approach this nexus, the food climate migration nexus, without further obscuring those structural inequalities and histories of violence that are at the root cause, while also not dismissing those experiences that very well might fit some criteria yet to exist, but some sort of climate-related displacement criteria? And so how do we avoid doing further harm or epistemic violence to those who fall into that category of those displaced by climatic events of any duration?
Thank you, Megan. That's a super good question that I do not know the answer to, but I will share a few thoughts. And I think one is just the importance of letting people speak to their experience on their own terms. I think when you are actually doing work with small scale farmers organizations, when you're working with social movement organizations, when you are talking to farmers and mothers and young people who've migrated, allowing them to actually say what they have experienced and what their notions of justice are and what they actually would like to see is, I think, one of the most important things we can do as researchers. It's hard to talk about these things without kind of pathologizing, right? And if you listen to people's stories, what you find is heroic examples of people making it work for each other, for their families, for their communities, despite tremendous odds, even if it looks really imperfect sometimes. So I think that would be one piece. How we sort of think about these issues, climate displacement, the food, climate migration nexus, I think focusing on a sort of broader framework around agrarian justice or a just transition in the rural world, which many social movement organizations are starting to pick up, including movements for food sovereignty, movements for agroecology. I think the Transnational Institute, Jenny Franco and June Boris have a really good framework for thinking about this nexus and what agrarian justice really might look like, what agrarian climate justice might look like, and they call it the 5 R's: recognition, restitution, redistribution, regeneration, and representation or resistance. So redistribution of access and control over national resources, recognition of Indigenous rights, of the rights of women and other marginalized groups, restitution where people have lost their land, and territories, and savings, and pensions, and natural resources to corporate land and resource grabs, regeneration of agroecological relationships, and the resistance, the organizing, the representation that might actually help us get there, right? We can only get there through really disruptive resistance to the status quo. So I find that as a really handy sort of framework for imagining what agrarian climate justice might look like. And I'm sure other folks on this panel actually have a much better idea.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annie. Yeah, there's not like a clear consensus on this possible label of climate-related displacement, but I think it's important, right, that we're having this constructive dialogue around it, what possibilities it might offer, and also the limitations and potential harm generated by it. So I don't know if others would like to chime in around this question. If not, we have other questions coming up in the chat.
Yeah.
Estelle, would you like to say something?
I just wanted to echo this R's that Annie was talking about. I think that's just so, it just really opens up my eyes to the complexity of this issue. And I've been thinking a lot about resistance and how important it is to think about how people are resisting to these oppressive structures, but also the joys that come from doing that. I think and maybe this is just because, you know, we read so much about this and our brains are like, oh man, this is just like the world is so catastrophic. But thinking about what are the joys and in which ways migrants find joys in their paths of migration, I think it's something I've been thinking about as well. So resistance and joy.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the previous comments. They're really excellent. So this is really to complement what's been said, but I really like the R framework. Just to repeat maybe something which has been said by a couple of you, Lisa and Annie, it seems very important to have a very systemic view to expand our perspective of time, so history and space, and the complexity of whatever is in that system. Now, and at our center, we've been in conversation with a number of activist scholars as well as farmers, indigenous people who are talking on their own terms. And we try to understand what could increase the chances of transformation understood as exiting the dead end of industrial food and farming, whether it's in its capitalist, communist, or authoritarian socialist form. How do we exit that? And that's a difficult question, but we homed in together on a number of important dimensions of change, and they all have to change together. The whole question of access to natural ecosystems, including land, water, and seeds, which several of you have referred to. The need to look at ways of moving out of capitalist economics and also patriarchal economics, looking at plural systems of economic exchange and markets, not just money-based markets, but economies of care, solidarity, and so on. Really important to focus on that. The other one is recognizing the inadequacy of existing knowledge produced by research centers and universities. We don't have knowledge that equips us to deal with many of the challenges facing us, whether it's in food, health, or other areas. And we need to develop very different knowledge. And that's a big challenge. How do we transform knowledge and ways of knowing? The other area which we felt was really important is finding ways of strengthening local organizations and the networks they form, because this is a very important lever for social change. Working with local organizations and their networks to build their capacity to exert countervailing power. The question of discourses on modernity and progress still needs to be challenged. It's legitimating all kinds of developments like the fourth industrial revolution I mentioned, but also the perpetuation of gender-blind policies, etc. And that brings me to this next dimension around equity, gender, and diversity. Really working with these notions of gender and intersectional justice, and link with that the questions of restitutions of stolen resources, grabbed land, which Annie was referring to. And then finally, how do we open up democracy? How do we correct or reverse the current democratic deficit in decision-making, in policy choices, institutional choices? How do we foster much more inclusive, deliberative, and more direct forms of democracy to supplement or even replace current forms of representative democracy? So we've been trying to play around with these different dimensions to think about pathways to transformation for agroecology and food sovereignty in particular, but it borrows from other social movements, other conversations, for example, the degrowth movement and feminist political ecologists. So I guess that's maybe the other thing is that we need to go out of our comfort zones and interact with many other social groups in society who are experiencing these problems in different ways, but they're certainly perceiving their gravity. And it's important in a transdisciplinary spirit to have these conversations with many other groups we don't necessarily interact with from where we are, because that's a tremendous source of learning. It's a source of enrichment, and it builds solidarities and the kinds of alliances that are going to be needed to change things for the better. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Lisa, did you want to add something?
30 seconds. I'll be 30 seconds.
All
yeah.
Right,
I mean, in this context of listening and learning from the stories that already exist, and then in relation to Annie's point on not pathologizing, right, and resisting the tendency to pathologize, I think, I've done it in my talk, right? I'm thinking with Stephanie Abarca's insight on the need to write back in the forces of reproduction into stories of destruction, or Rebecca Solnit's point, right, that we've written out the victories when we focus on these interlocking mechanisms of displacement. And so I think maybe the story also has other starting points, right? The persistence of already adaptive, climate smart food cultures. Maybe it looks like recognizing the indicators of displacement migration are also sources of reemplacement and sources by which people live out their aspirations and achieve micro transformations. And this is something Gidwani and Ramamurthy write about really beautiful in India, the micro transformations of female migrant laborers who, yes, are displaced from the countryside, but also enact sort of transformations of regional patriarchal structures in so going. So I'll stop there, but these were wonderful remarks. Thanks all for the thoughts. Yeah.
So yeah, there's several questions popping up in the chat, and it seems like perhaps where we just left off, I might continue to the most recent question from Alex. The consequences of neoliberalism and disinvestment in agriculture seem like really big, intractable issues to address. Is the idea of climate smart agriculture and resilience building just a dream? And I think, I'll just add on our roundtable, there are several of you, and really everyone has a stake in studying and disseminating knowledge systems that stem from agroecological practices. So we see this tension unfolding of the global industrial food system and its powerful reach translating to widespread displacement, whereas agroecology can help, as Lisa just beautifully summarized, can help re-emplace people. And as Michelle elaborated previously, translate to a regenerative relationship with the land. So I'm not sure who would like to comment perhaps on this question first, but I sort of read it as, is there a reason to hope, to hold on to some sort of hope or optimism for a climate smart agriculture, or however you would like to frame it?
I can jump in with a quick thought, and just because it's so related to my sensibility that the climate smart technologies and cultures already exist. And that, how climate smart is conceived and operationalized is the critical variable to me as to whether it can still be a dream or whether it is just another kind of nightmare. And in particular, I think what I feel is displacement upon displacement is the injunction that farmers adopt climate smart technologies that are sort of piecemeal solutions, precision irrigation or these kinds of things, or genetically modified seeds, which are more drought tolerant. And these, continue this kind of neoliberal governmentality that accompanies the pullback of states from smallholder ag, that accompanies all state sort of paving of the way for capital by further devolving adaptation onto the individual when, and requiring often a full-time farmer when that is an impossibility in current agrarian circumstances. So I think it's a beautiful question. I hold out hope, and but I think that the how and the why and the by whom and under whose vision of climate smart are the variables that give us hope or give us maybe not so much hope. Yeah.
I would just say, yes, absolutely hope, because there's hundreds and thousands and millions of small-scale farmers organizing and practicing agroecology all over the world in spite of those hideous odds, right? And on a range of things, from rehabilitating traditional livestock varieties in Kazakhstan to drought-resistant agroecology in Pakistan to zero-budget natural farming in India to peasant collectives in Mesoamerica that are doing really excellent soil fertility work. This is happening all over the world. The Via Campesina, which is one of the largest social movements in the world, which is turning 30 just next year. Agroecology has been a key tenet of their organizing over the last 15 years. And that's not the only venue. There is a groundswell of grassroots agroecology work happening all over the world that is being tremendously impactful in spite of all of these stacked odds, in spite of the fact that university systems are not designing their research to meet the science and technology and natural resource needs of small-scale farmers, despite liberalization. So what could we do with all of that groundswell of energy if it was connected and had a little bit of political voice? And people say, oh, can we scale up agroecology? Absolutely, it already is scaling up. And if we could sort of get governments and corporations out of the way that enormous groundswell of energy might actually appear on the international level to those of us that don't do this work as tremendously hopeful, right? There's these lighthouses all over the world, shining little bright beams on the way forward. And the challenge is really to connect them so that we all can see it.
Yeah, yeah, very much echo what Annie has just said. And the importance of building alliances from below, building that countervailing power. But I think the question posed used the word disinvestment. So I'm taking this quite literally about disinvesting finance from doing bad things, because there'd be greater hope if some of the parts of the global architecture were challenged and changed. I remember Secretary General Antonio Guterres at the last COP26 saying that promises to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are pointless while governments around the world persist with investments in fossil fuels. Promises ring hollow when the fossil fuel industry still receives trillions of dollars in subsidies, quote unquote. And here I think we need to look critically at some of the disabling processes that impede that transition or transformation towards agroecology, sustainable food systems, permaculture, regenerative farming. I don't use the word climate smart agriculture because it's been kind of tainted and in a way it's a form of co-optation of agroecology that locks systems in a productivist model. But I get the gist of how do we encourage this shift towards regenerative, life affirmative ways of working with the land and feeding ourselves. But I do think this question of disinvestment is very important in this context. You know, disinvest in major greenhouse gas emitters and drivers of biodiversity loss. So if we take the world production of nitrogen fertilizer, that accounts, the production and use accounts for 21.5% of annual direct emissions from agriculture in 2018. And yet there are attempts to increase synthetic nitrogen fertilizer use by 50% by 2050. And of course, the big companies like Yara and CF Industries are pushing behind. So there's a case that needs to be made here and push for the financial institutions disinvesting in agribusiness corporations. And the power of these financial institutions is remarkable. It's locking the system in and creating those dynamics which are leading to climate change, migration, destitution, etc. In the UK, we've just had a study showing that UK financial institutions, their estimated carbon emissions in 2021, all sectors confused, combined, not just food and agriculture, account for 805 million tons of CO2. So if the financial institutions were a country, they would have the 9th largest emissions in the world, larger than Germany. Now, these are dinosaurs that need to be tackled for us to have hope. Simultaneously with helping build those alliances from below, those forms of countervailing power. And I think we need to strategize much, much more and act to deal with the very, very powerful and contain their power, disarm them. There's not a great deal of time left. So I'll stop there just to indicate that there's two.
Yeah. I interpret your final or last words there as there's a double entendre. We're running out of time on this panel and also globally as a species, as a global society. So I want to turn to a few other questions in the chat. I'm going to weave them together. Andrew asks, could immobility or even trapped populations be a potential outcome that becomes more likely because of the nexus that you've identified so well? So that's one question. And then there's two that I see could be folded to some extent into one. From Andrea, is international law addressing the issue? What kind of policies do we need? And Christian adds, do the panelists have any thoughts on the recent UN Food Summit?
In the spirit of quick time, I'll speak to this first point on immobility and trapped populations. And I think that is concurrent with outmigration. And it's happening because of, in some senses, the gender divisions and the structures of care work that have been created by liberalization, by divestment, by the pushing of commercialized crops that have removed women's role or taken it out of vegetable production and its centrality to food production in the region of Sulawesi, that, for instance, have made women sort of marginal agricultural producers in the context of male-dominated commodity crops. And so the more common pattern is that, yes, people outmigrate, but other people are trapped in place to sort of stitch together livelihoods and lives and the reproduction of basic agrarian holdings in the absence of so much labor from villages. So I think it's this trapped populations is a potential outcome. It's already an outcome that's happening, and that it's concurrent with some of the other sort of mobility trends we're seeing. But I think it's a really powerful frame for thinking with this nexus. So I'll take on just that first question, and I will try.
Thanks, Lisa. I don't know if others want to speak to the second set of questions, but I'll add that this event today marks the informal or soft launch of our emerging food climate migration nexus network of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers, through which we're hoping to inform more comprehensive, socially and environmentally just and compassionate solutions at various scales. So I think, there's such a wealth of experience on this roundtable today. So I do want to close by giving an opportunity to speak for others to speak to some of the shortcomings that are currently characterizing the sort of global policy context, but also to speak to what forms of success you all have had in connecting with those in policy and or practitioners, people on the ground, to translate the research you've done into broader applications.
I can talk, but I know Michelle might have really beautiful things to say. I know Esteli might have beautiful things to say.
We have time, just go ahead.
I'll just say one of the things that I think a network is really good for is creating long-term relationships. And I'm part of a group called the Agroecology Research Action Network that Esteli is also part of. And the goal of that group is just to create really stable, sort of trusting, thoughtful relationships between academics, activists, grassroots organizations, practitioners, so that we can do rapid response when it's needed. So when organizations have a particular need, that we might be able to respond a little better, and so that we can develop ideas and research agendas together, so that those research agendas actually do serve the immediate needs and the sort of long-term goals of people doing the work on the ground. And that takes some structures for communication, for mutual understanding, for trust building. So that's one of the things I think a network like this might be really good at, is just facilitating that communication and relationship building, so that research can ultimately be more effective.
Thank you.
I can also follow up on this, on Annie's comment with building community-based research programs that respond to community needs. I think that's so important. But Michelle was also talking about transdisciplinary work, right? Not just across or pushing academic disciplinary boundaries, but also forcing, or not forcing, but encouraging our scholarship to be more aligned with community needs and community processes. I think that's so important. Yeah, that's what I wanted to echo. Thank you.
I would simply add, because I don't want to take too much time, I've already spoken a lot. Where my work has perhaps been most powerful is when I've been able to create safe spaces for local actors, farmers, pastoralists, indigenous people to speak on their own terms, to analyze trends from their own knowledge systems and their own visions of the good life. And linking those local voices with national or even global policy processes. And I've found that that way of working has been profoundly destabilizing for the established order and has really created some success stories which have led to overturning very technocratic decisions around, say, development in Andhra Pradesh, a Vision 2020 development in Andhra Pradesh, which was more or less an attempt to implant prairie-style agriculture in dryland India and displace something like 30 million farmers, dryland farmers, with no thoughts to what kind of livelihoods they would have in the cities or beyond. Those processes that have enabled marginalized voices, excluded voices to come in more center stage in shaping relevant knowledge, relevant policy decisions, or even formulating policy, I think have been incredibly powerful. And I view that as perhaps the most successful work because it really has helped change lives. I would really encourage a younger generation of scholars, particularly activist scholars, to go down that way, which brings you much more into, a participatory action research dynamic, liberatory inquiry. And many of the issues that we've been talking about can be enriched by those conversations involving people who talk on their own terms and advance their own agendas, their own visions, their own ideas of buen vivir, sumak koizai, or Swaraj. That's really important for reasons of cognitive epistemic justice, which was mentioned earlier, but also because so much is missed out by academia. We have partial and incomplete knowledge, and it's very, very important that we find ways of developing processes that generate collective intelligence needed to address these pressing social, ecological, environmental, and political problems. Anyway, I'll stop there because I don't want.
That's wonderful. No, I think actually that is a wonderful note to end on, just that we need to continue thinking collectively and working across sectors and disciplines and spaces toward a more just future. So with that, I want to say farewell to everyone. Thank you so much for attending today's event. Thank you so much to all of the participants on the roundtable for this very rich discussion. And if you have interest in becoming a member participating in the Food Climate Migration Network, which is just emerging, please do not hesitate to get in touch. Okay. Thank you again, and good afternoon, or have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world, as we're across many time zones at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you for putting this together.